All right, I'm going to pray first, and then we'll get started, guys. Father, thank you so much for this time here tonight. Thank you for being a God who sees us, who knows every single thing, every single detail about us, and things that we don't even know about ourselves, like the plan that you already have for our lives. Father, I pray that tonight your word is spoken loud and clear about how you love us and how you see us. I pray it'll help us to change the way we live, that it will change our hearts, that it will change our minds about who you are and what you can do in our lives. Father, please help us all to be inspired by your word, by Hannah and her character and the way she saw you. So, Father, I lay this time before you. Remove any of my own flaws that may get in the way, and I just pray that you take control. I lay this all before you, Lord. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Amen. So I hope tonight that you guys will also be as inspired by Hannah as I was as I've been reading about her in the past couple of weeks. So let's just go there. She's in 1 Samuel 1. And I'm just going to read chapter 1, but her story doesn't necessarily end there. Okay. In 1 Samuel chapter 1, starting in verse 1, it says, "There was a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zuphite from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. He had 2 wives. One was called Hannah, and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. Year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh, where Hophni and Phinehas, the 2 sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord. Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. And because the Lord had closed her womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Elkanah, her husband, would say to her, "Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons?" Once they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on a chair by the doorpost of the Lord's temple. In bitterness of soul, Hannah wept much and prayed to the Lord, and she made a vow, saying, "O Lord Almighty, if you will only look upon your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head." As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, but her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk and said to her, "How long will you keep on getting drunk? Get rid of your wine." "Not so, my lord," Hannah replied. "I'm a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief." Eli answered, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." She said, "May your servant find favor in your eyes." Then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Early the next morning they arose and worshipped before the Lord, and then went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah lay with his wife, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, "Because I asked the Lord for him." When the man Elkanah went up with all his family to offer the annual sacrifice to the Lord and to fulfill his vow, Hannah did not go. She said to her husband, "After the boy is weaned, I will take him and present him before the Lord, and he will live there always." "Do what seems best to you," Elkanah, her husband, told her. "Stay here until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord make good his word to you." So the woman stayed at home and nursed her son until she had weaned him. After he was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. When they had slaughtered the bull, they brought the boy to Eli, and she said to him, "As surely as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord." And he worshiped the Lord there. So I know that was a long chunk of text, and we'll go through it piece by piece, but this setting of the story, so this 1 Samuel comes during a time right after the book of Judges, right? So Ruth is before this, and then Judges is before that. And the very last verse in Judges 21:25, it says, "In those days Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit." And it's during this time that we're introduced to this man Elkanah. Though he's from, we learned some things about Elkanah. He's from the Kohathite clan. And that was a clan of priests who were dedicated to the sacred things, the most sacred things of the temple, including the Ark of the Covenant. But we see this man in this setting practicing polygamy. His home life is a little messy. He has 2 wives, and they're rivals and battling each other. One is able to conceive children, one is not, and that's Hannah. We see in verses 4 and 5 and verse 8 that Elkanah did favor Hannah. He did give her a double portion of meat, and he showed concern for her saddened state, right, when she was miserable. And we also learn that Hannah's being tormented by the other wife because of her inability to have kids, especially sons. So this is the source of her misery. And commentaries will say that when there were polygamy families or polygamous families, they would live in separate tents. So the husband would have wives in these different tents. But it was during the time of the feast that Hannah had to be in close quarters with this woman. So she would have to eat at the same table, be in the same tent, be on the road with her. So you can imagine how that misery would stir up during the time of the feast. I mean, just even think about this situation. Neither her home life nor her travel life is the ideal setting for any woman. I imagine her waiting alone in her tent when she was home, knowing that her husband was with his other wife, enjoying his whole family. You know, talk about feeling forgotten. Talk about feeling abandoned. I know I wouldn't want that. I would get out of that situation as quickly as I could. But this is Hannah. In this moment, in this time where people are doing whatever they want to, she could have just sat in her sorrow and feeling forgotten and abandoned. And I think the feeling of being forgotten is truly awful, right? I don't know if you've ever felt forgotten as a child. Maybe your parents forgot you somewhere. Or even if people leave you out of their plans, or, you know, somebody forgets a special day like your birthday. And there are bigger things that we can do to hurt each other's feelings when we forget those things. But it's really an awful feeling to feel forgotten or abandoned. I think it most often manifests itself in my life if I feel left out, or I feel like I was left behind, or I have that fear of missing out sometimes, where I want to be in everything and be a part of everything. But I can imagine that as Hannah endured the snide remarks of her sister wife and prayed year after year after year for a child with no child to show for her own, she may have even felt forgotten by God. I don't know if you guys can ever relate to that. Feeling like maybe God didn't hear me. I've been praying for this for a long time. I think he doesn't have time to answer my prayer right now. Or maybe there are more pressing things, you know? Do you ever feel like God has been distant? or that he doesn't have time for you? Do you feel forgotten? Have you ever felt forgotten? And if not by God, have you felt forgotten by people? I think this is what struck me the most about Hannah and how she saw God. So tonight, the title of my lesson is Remember That You Are Not Forgotten. And my first point is this: remember how God sees you. I think this is something Hannah really understood about God. So consider these two wives. Imagine both their situations. Hannah being the favorite, Peninnah being the one that had the children. Both kind of seemed bitter, or had the predisposition to be bitter with their situations. But each one of them had a different response. While Peninnah resorted to putting Hannah down to make herself feel better, Hannah took her bitterness to God. She did not resort to retaliation, though she was the favorite of the two wives and could have easily thrown that in her rival's face. And as we examine Hannah's prayer in verse 11, she asks very specific things of God. One, that he would look upon her misery. Two, that he would remember her and not forget her. And three, the desire of her heart, that he would give her a son. The thing that hooked me is that she asked God to remember her and not forget her. Why does she ask that? And what does God do with that? It says in verse 19, he remembered her. Why is it that we love being remembered? Why is it that we love it when people remember things about us, about our family, about our children? I think it conveys care, consideration, compassion. It gives you value. You're important. You were remembered, right? And I've been thinking about this, and I've been asking God, what is it about Hannah and this prayer that you need us to know? And what I think God is trying to show us, and what he's been trying to show us through his word, is that he values us as women. He values us. We are precious. He even says that in Isaiah 43. We're precious to him. We're honored by him. He cares for us, and he has great purpose for our lives. I'll say that again. He cares for us, and he has great purpose for our lives. Especially in societies and cultures where women are discounted, dismissed, God uses them for greatness. And this is not just in biblical times. This is even in our times now. This week, starting on Friday at sunset, it will be Passover in Jewish tradition until next week, Saturday. And, a lot of us are familiar with the idea of Passover and the story in Exodus. We may have seen the Prince of Egypt, and we may have seen how God used that time to deliver his people, a whole nation of people from the Egyptians, right? This week, as the staff women, we've been reading an article about Passover and how Moses has always been the center of, or the star of the Passover story, the freeing of the slaves, the Israelite slaves from the Egyptians, right? That's how we know. That's even how the Prince of Egypt goes in the movie. But the article talks about how the Passover really started with women. And as you read in Exodus, and even in I think this is just the spirit. God just wants you guys to know this. But even as we met as family group leaders, a couple of other women were talking about how they read the exact same thing this week. It's no coincidence. But it's incredible to see how God used women, the midwives, who Pharaoh told to kill the Israelite male-born children, who defied Pharaoh because they feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. He used those women to allow Moses to be born. And then Moses, his mother, instead of throwing him into the water, instead of drowning him, put him in a little basket, right? And his sister is the one that watched him float down the river until Pharaoh's own daughter found this child, Moses. And Miriam goes to this princess. Miriam, a slave of the Israelites, goes to the Egyptian princess to say, can I get for you one of the Hebrew women to nurse this child? Just not even thinking of her own safety, not even thinking that she could be thrown in jail or she could be taken away, or she puts her fears to the side to go to this woman and see a shred of humanity in her, to think, you can save my brother. And because of her act, we had Moses, who delivered an entire people into freedom. It's incredible.
Yes.
Moses gets the spotlight, but these women, they were brave.
Yes.
They were faithful. And they did not let the society around them determine how they would serve God.
Yes.
But we see these examples. I mean, that's just one of the many examples. And God litters the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament, with stories just like this. Women like Sarah, who had great faith, left her whole family to follow this husband who God spoke to. Right? We see her not given to fear. We see Ruth, who was used to, who stayed with her mother-in-law. We see Jael, who becomes a military hero by driving a tent peg through a man's temple. They're amazing women. Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist. Mary, the mother of Jesus. Martha, the dear friend and student of Jesus. These are just a few of the women who are amazing, that God has used to do great things. And I think Hannah's story shows us that God sees us and he remembers us. And this word remember is not like he goes about his business and then snaps his finger and says, oh my goodness, I forgot to do this for Faye. No, the word remember is used multiple times in the scriptures. And it says that it's a sense that he's taking action on his promises. He's already working. He's already doing what he's promised you he would do in his word as a response to your prayer. He sees you. He has a purpose for you. He remembers you. And even if we don't see it right away, he's still working. Even if we don't get the answer that moment, he's still doing what he already said he would do. He already has a plan for your life that he desires to put into action. It all depends on our willingness to surrender. In Isaiah 43:18-19, it says, forget the former things. Do not dwell on the past. See, I'm doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I'm making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wastelands. God is doing the impossible. He's doing the incredible. He's doing the beautiful. But we have to be in line with him through our prayers to be able to see it. And the great thing is that it's not about our fickle faith. We can be up, down, in between on any given hour of the day, right? Our emotions can take control. Our faith can plummet or our faith can soar. But it's about God's faithfulness. He is never, ever going to let down or go back on his word. The level of our own faith does not determine the fact that he looks at us with care, consideration, and purpose. The things that we think will never change are changeable for God.
Amen.
The desires that go unmet can be satisfied by God. And I think that's what Hannah understood. That's what she saw about God. My second point is that we need to remember how we need to see God. We know how God sees us, but let's look a little bit deeper at how Hannah shows us how we need to see God. So she prays this prayer, and she ends it in verse 11 with this vow that kind of tears at my own heart, because she says that she will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life. She makes this Nazirite vow that you may have heard before with Samson, where it says, no razor will touch his head, he will drink no fermented drink, he will not eat anything from the vine. It's a very specific vow that comes from the book of Numbers. And the person can make the vow for themselves. There's usually a time that you dedicate. It could be any course of time. But she chooses to go all in dedicating her son for all the days of his life. This is the son she has been desiring with her whole heart. Why did she do that? Why did she do this up front? Before he even answers a prayer, before there's any inkling that God will answer this prayer, she says, God, if you answer it, I will give him to you. I will not keep him. He will be yours all the days of his life. How can you pray and ask for something and then give it away? Especially a child. So that part really tugged at my heart. Why did she do it that way? I think I even look at her rival, and her rival didn't have to give up her kids. This other wife didn't have to sacrifice her kids to get blessed, right? Why did Hannah go so far as to give up her child? I was like, is this desperation? Is this what faith looks like? What's the motivation? And then I look at the life she had on paper. I mean, we know the things that were emotional for her, but on paper, she had so much. She had a husband who was of a good standing. He was an elite priestly descendant. He had love and affection for her and favoritism. She was well provided for. I mean, what else could a woman back then want besides a child? But these things, all these things that were good, that she could have found comfort in, she would not let satisfy her. She would not let her great husband satisfy her. She would not let her protection, her home, these things were not going to be it for her. She was not going to just be satisfied with that. You know, I even looked at the way she responded to these tough situations, and lashing out at her rival would not satisfy her because she didn't do it. Retorting to Eli the prophet, who was telling her, you look like you're drunk, when his sons were getting corrupted and drunk, she didn't say anything about that. Right? There's so many ways. That would have tasted really good. You know, being able to really hand it to somebody, that can taste really good. But we see a woman of great self-control, of righteousness, but most importantly, reliance on God. And I think she knew that a child wouldn't be the thing to satisfy her either. That would not be it for her. I think it would quell the harshness of her rival and maybe restore her honor. But what I see in Hannah is a woman whose satisfaction came from God alone. In verse 18, her only relief came from her time in prayer with God and the word from his prophet. And it reminds me so much of what the Bible tells us in Psalm 37. In verse 4-6, it says, take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord. Trust in him, and he will do this. He will make your righteous reward shine like the dawn, your vindication like the noonday sun. And isn't this exactly what God did for Hannah? Isn't it exactly? And we didn't read it, but later on in chapter 2, she's blessed with more children, 5 more children later on, even after she gave up her first son. But in verse 19-20, Hannah was able to see God's faithfulness in action. She experienced his faithfulness through her raw, emotional, but persistent prayers. She saw God keep his promise. And as we think through her story even further, this may have been why she was able to make good on her own promise. So remember the vow she made. Because imagine finally having your child being placed on your chest, handed to you. Women keep telling me about what that moment will be like. When my baby comes and they just hand her over and I get to hold her and fall in love with her, I'd never want to let go. I see Dorothy with Oscar and how he just snuggles into her. And I remember her telling me that he would wiggle a certain way that felt like it was like he was in her womb. You know, how could you give that up? There's a fearlessness and a boldness that this woman Hannah displays. Being able to give up her child to serve God. And there were so many other ways to do it. But she gave him to God for his whole life. And what would happen if Hannah decided to take control of her own situation? What if she gave in to the things that Satan was whispering she was entitled to? What would happen if she did not wait for God? Would Samuel even exist? Would he exist to give the Israelites their first king? Would he exist to anoint David to take Saul's place? And would David be the king through whose bloodline it was prophesied the Messiah would come? There's something powerful in her story. If you think about the feeling of being forgotten, the powerful feeling of loneliness and abandonment, some of us have been praying for specific things for a long time. And it's easy to feel forgotten by God. Or we may easily forget God as we try to take control, going and doing the things that we think will get us what we've been asking for, by relying on ourselves to get the job done. But this woman endured year after year of ridicule and torment and felt bitterness and misery as a result of it. However, she continued to bring it before God persistently. She asked him to see her in her state, that ugly state of bitterness, of weakness, of sadness, to see how she really felt and to remember her. He shows us through Hannah that he is a God who is powerful, a God who already has great purpose for our lives, a God who will never forget us, never forsake us, never ever devalue us. In return, we need to be the women like Hannah who also remember God, who are satisfied with him, and who trust in his plan. For me, it means I need to admit that I'm weak, that I don't have it all together, that I need help with a lot in certain areas of my life and my ministry. I need to admit when my feelings are hurt, when I feel forgotten or left out, instead of trying to act tough, like I'm okay, and just keep rolling with it. And I think not just to the women that God has placed in my life, but to God, because he tells me it's through my weakness that his strength is made perfect. He needs to hear the ugly parts of my emotion instead of me trying to do it my own way. What does it mean for you? What does this mean for you? Are you trying to control your own destiny? Are you leaving God out of your plans? Are you lacking self-control? I think for all of us, it's going to take a change in the way we see God, a change of mind and heart about what role he plays in our lives compared to the millions of other things that Satan is whispering in our ears to grab our attention on a daily basis. I really appreciate listening to Whitney and Jeannie sharing about the prayers that God has answered for them. It so much demonstrates that surrender, that trust, not taking things into your own hands and seeing the miracles that come out of it. I think as we wrap up this first quarter, like Dion started talking about, the first quarter of our year and focus on prayer, I wanted to leave you guys with some prayer helps of mine, scriptures that I read before I pray to help remind me of who I'm praying to help me to see the God who wants to already answer my prayers. In Isaiah 43, 1-4, I see a God who sees me as precious and honored, who tells me straight up, I love you. In Jeremiah 31:3, I see a God who wants to be near to me. Isaiah 6, 1-7, I love because I see a God who is huge. Only a piece of his mantle is in this throne room. And he's bigger and more powerful. His throne room is shaking and falling apart with the amazing praise that his entourage is giving him. So I love looking at these scriptures to help set my mind as I'm going to God, to remind me, yes, I can be weak before you. Yes, I can give you all my burdens, all my emotions. Yes, you are powerful enough to change situations in my life, to make things move. So, ladies, I hope as we move into the next phase of our year, you will continue to be dedicated to prayer, dedicated to the God who sees you, who loves you, and values you more than you could ever imagine. Amen.
Amen.